Hello, my name is Aaron Marvel and thank you for watching the video series over Assessment for Learning. In this video, we're going to talk about the difference between Assessment for Learning versus Assessment of Learning. We have three lesson objectives in this video. First, we are going to define Assessment of Learning and Assessment for Learning. Then we are going to distinguish how they are different. And then lastly, provide a simple example of Assessment for Learning. We define assessment of learning as gathering and evaluating information to be converted into a value to communicate the end result of student learning. Essentially, we're gathering information, evaluating it for quality, and then converting it into a number or a letter so that we can communicate that to students, to parents, or ourselves. Assessment for learning, on the other hand, generally does not come in the form of numbers, and it is not necessarily the end result of student learning. It is gathering information to provide ongoing descriptive feedback to guide students' process through their learning. So let's look at a few examples of assessment of learning. First of all, we have a report card. Everyone's familiar with that. It gives you a summary of how a student has done over the 9 weeks or 6 weeks or maybe a few weeks over the whole curriculum in several subjects. So it's at the end result and it's communicated by a number. We also have GPAs. They are obviously something more of a long-term communication of how a student has done, but again, it is number form, not based on learning targets, not very descriptive. And then lastly, we have a graph that depicts how a class did on a test and broken down by certain learning targets. Now this is a little bit more specific, but it's still based on numbers and it doesn't give a student specific information to help him in his learning process. So why do we use assessment of learning? Why is it important, or can we not do it at all and just use assessment for learning? Well, assessment of learning is something that is essential that we cannot get rid of. First of all, it helps us to verify the mastery of curriculum, just like the report card we were looking at, to ensure that a student has attained to a certain level that we feel like is appropriate, hopefully if that report card is representative of what he actually knows. Second, it confirms what students know, just like the bar graph that depicted how the class did on certain learning targets, on learning target 7.6 and 7.7 and so on and so on. And lastly, to provide information for placement decisions, such as if I was a boss and I asked two students that were applying to give me their GPAs and on the application, I might use this GPA in order to decide which student I prefer to hire for my business. So there are a few things that we try sometimes to use assessment of learning for, but it's not really intended for, and it does a poor job. First of all, to give feedback for students concerning gaps in learning. While it is true that it hopefully communicates how a student is doing in a certain subject, it does not tell the student specifically where the gaps are. If a student is making an 86, there is a gap in learning somewhere, but he doesn't know where. Sometimes we try to use it to motivate students by using it as leverage to get them to do homework or to study for a test, but often this actually just diminishes motivation. We also try to use assessment of learning to help students feel in control of their learning. We tell students if you work really hard, if you study really hard, then your grade will be higher. However, that's not always the case. A student may not know what to study. They may not have an idea of where they are or where their gaps are, and in that case, studying may actually not have much of an effect at all. Next, we try to use it to plan for instruction. And while I do believe that it has its place in planning for instruction, it does not give us specifics about where the gaps are. Once again, it just provides number data. And lastly, to establish a classroom climate based on a growth mindset. Often students receive grades back or homework grades back, and instead of communicating that you can do better, you're just on your way to mastery, it confirms what they've always known about themselves, especially if they've been a low-performing student historically. It just confirms that so that it actually reduces motivation and their view of themselves. So let's look at a few examples of different types of assessment for learning. And remember, assessment for learning is gathering information in order to provide descriptive feedback specific to learning targets. Rubrics are great for this because they actually have the learning target in one of the columns and different levels of quality for each learning target, so the students know exactly what their goals are for a specific assignment. Self-reflection is also a great way to get students to think about learning targets, to think about where they are now, to think about where they're going and how to get there. And lastly, descriptive feedback gives teachers the opportunity to tell a student specifically where they are in a learning target, what they need to work on, and also not just from teacher to student, but also student to student. So, why would we want to use assessment for learning? First of all, if we look at the research, it shows us that assessment for learning yields a 5 times higher effect size than smaller class sizes. So in essence, instead of lowering your class size, implement assessment for learning, and you can expect 5 times greater results than you would have if you had just lowered your class sizes. Second, assessment for learning becomes the driving force for learning, not just the measure for learning. And we'll talk about that later in later videos. Third, it provides the opportunity for students to think about their learning. If students aren't thinking about the learning and the learning targets, then are they really learning? Assessment for learning also provides intrinsic motivation for our students, as it gives them ownership over their learning and gives the responsibility back to them, and provides a way for them to see when they succeed in comparing past performances to current performances. And lastly, it gives the opportunity to students to set their own goals and to meet their own goals. And when they meet those goals, it goes back to motivation. It feels good to succeed, and they know they want to do it again. So we're going to look at a simple example of 2 students who have 2 different teachers. However, they both have 8th grade algebra. So first we have Rick and we have Wendy. However, both the teachers are going to approach assessment in the classroom differently. So let's look at Rick first. So Rick walks into class and his teacher writes on the board y equals mx plus b. He explains a little bit about what y equals mx plus b means, and he begins teaching. So he does some examples on the board, and then they do some practice together, and then they do some independent work. And he does this from several different angles because he's a pretty good teacher, and this takes about a week or 2. And then at the end of the week, they take an exam. And so Rick takes this exam and he gets a 78. So at the end of the whole unit, if I came in the classroom and asked Rick some questions, and asked him to think about some things, would he be able to answer them? So some of these questions might be, when you began the unit, were you able to answer, what do I know, or what can I do currently? Did the teacher give him an opportunity to think about those things? Could he answer, what do I need to know or be able to do before the unit began? Could he answer, how am I going to get there? How am I going to reach those goals by the end of the unit? And lastly, at any point during the instruction, could I ask Rick, how are you doing? And could he answer that? And I would say, based on what we've explained here, no, he couldn't, because the teacher did not give him an opportunity to reflect on past learning, didn't give him an opportunity to think about what his learning targets are, tactics and strategies and how to get there. Very few opportunities to actually reflect on learning and look at learning standards. So let's look at the way Wendy's teacher approaches assessment for learning. So when she walks in, the teacher has on the board the learning target. Use data from a table and graph to determine the slope and y-intercept in math and real-world problems. And so the teacher asks the students to underline words that they've seen before and circle words that are completely new to them. And so the students begin underlining and circling, and Wendy realizes she's never heard of slope, she's never heard of y-intercept. And so those are 2 words that she knows she wants to learn. So the teacher also asks the students to pull out their portfolios and pull out certain assignments that give evidence that they understand how to plot points and how to read tables. And so the students begin looking at the assignments, and they start thinking about what they've learned about in the past units about plotting and reading tables, and they realize that some of this they already understand. They're just going to have to add some more learning on top of that. From there, they start to realize there are some things that they don't understand, and so they begin setting goals. Wendy sets the goal, I want to learn the definition of slope and y-intercept, and she has another goal, I want to be able to take an equation and use it to draw a line on a graph. And so the teacher begins teaching, and she starts providing different kinds of strategies and different kinds of tactics in order to study, in order to learn these things, different types of visuals, and also teaches the students strategies in order to learn. Throughout the whole process, there's always a feedback loop between student to teacher and student to student. They're always going back to the learning target. How am I doing on this? Where do I need to go? Where are my gaps? Constantly thinking about the learning. So Wendy takes her exam and she receives an 85%, which really isn't that surprising to Wendy because she's been thinking about this through the whole unit. However, the teacher gave Wendy and the rest of the students an opportunity to review the exam. She actually asked them to look at 2 questions that were difficult and 1 question that was easy, get together in groups and discuss why those questions were difficult or easy, and then led the class into creating peer-to-peer tutor groups. So let's ask Wendy the same questions. At any point during the instruction, could I ask her, what do you know, or what can you do currently? I would say yes. She was constantly given the opportunity to think about her learning and to think about where she was going. Could she answer, what do you need to know or be able to do? Yes, again, she was always reflecting on her learning. Could she answer, how are you going to get there? Yes, the teacher gave her opportunities and to use the strategies and use the techniques in order to learn the information. And lastly, could I ask her, how are you doing? And yes, I believe she could. She could always tell me, well, yes, I'm missing this. This is difficult for me. Or yes, this is easy for me, and this is what I'm going to do in order to fill those gaps. So this sounds like a really simple example, and it really is. We're going to go into more detail in future lessons and exactly how to implement these assessment for learning techniques in order to get your kids thinking and reflecting on the learning. So in this lesson, we defined assessment of learning and assessment for learning. We distinguished how the two are different, and lastly, we provided a simple example of assessment for learning. Thank you so much for listening to episode 2 of Assessment for Learning, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.